You are listening to Professor Megan Workman. Welcome to this lesson on prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and the diversity of life. There are three main objectives for this lesson: thinking about the diversity of all life observed in nature. We're going to examine different ways biologists have grouped like organisms together. These are called classification systems. Next, we are going to examine distinguishing features of eukaryotic and prokaryotic forms of life. And we will end with a discussion of the function of membrane-bound organelles. So if you think of all the different types of organisms observed in nature, it can become confusing. There's so many. So scientists have devised a couple of different ways of grouping like organisms together in order to study their different properties. The first classification system we're going to look at is called the domain system, that separates all living things into just three categories: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Here are some example organisms in each of these three domains and some defining characteristics of the domains. So in the domain bacteria, all organisms are single-celled, meaning the entire individual is just one cell big. These are very small cells. They don't have any membrane-bound organelles. They don't have a nucleus. They do have DNA. It's just free-floating within the cell. Sometimes they have cell walls, and they all produce asexually, meaning one cell gives rise to an identical daughter cell when it reproduces. The middle panel here represents the archaea domain. They're similar to bacteria in that they are also small single-celled creatures. They lack membrane-bound organelles. They don't have a nucleus. They do have DNA because all cells have DNA. They also produce asexually. And one notable feature of archaea is that they're found in extreme environments. So environments that are very hot or have very high salinity, salt concentration. Here is a picture from a Yellowstone hot spring where you can see the rings of different colors. Each of these colors is produced by a different type of archaea. And they're living in this very, very hot, high sulfur environment where other types of organisms like bacteria could not exist. So archaea are extremophiles, meaning they love extreme environments. And then you and I as humans belong to the third domain, the eukaryotes, also called domain eukarya. There are example single-celled eukaryotes as well as multi-celled eukaryotes like humans. All eukaryotes have a nucleus surrounding and protecting our DNA, and some eukaryotes produce asexually while others produce sexually, meaning that two parents get together to produce the next generation. On this slide, you can see the evolutionary relationships between the three domains, and what you'll notice is that the archaea and the eukarya are more closely related. They share a common ancestor more recently in history than we do with bacteria. In this three-domain classification system, you'll notice that the top two domains consist of prokaryotes, and the bottom domain consists of eukaryotes. Eukaryotes, like humans, contain a nucleus where the DNA is protected inside and additional membrane-bound organelles. In contrast, bacteria and archaea are called prokaryotes, meaning that they do not have a nucleus or any membrane-bound organelles. Additional differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes are that while all prokaryotes produce only asexually, some eukaryotes can produce sexually. Sexual reproduction increases the genetic diversity of the next generation. Another difference is that eukaryotes have usually much more DNA, much more genetic material, and therefore more genes than do the smaller prokaryotes. Here is a micrograph, or a picture taken through a microscope, that demonstrates the size differences of these two types of cells. Eukaryotes are generally much larger. Here in this image, there are 3 large eukaryotic cells, each containing a stained nucleus. That's the dark blue dot. The tiny blue dots that are labeled bacteria, these are individual prokaryotic cells. So what you will notice is that thousands of prokaryotes could fit inside one eukaryotic cell. In addition to the 3-domain classification system, biologists also use simultaneously another classification system that breaks eukaryotes into more subgroups. This alternative classification system is called the kingdom system. There are 6 kingdoms: bacteria, archaea, animals, fungus, plants, and protists. Within the 6-kingdom classification system, the prokaryotic kingdoms are identical to the prokaryotic domains. Bacteria domain is the same as the bacteria kingdom. Archaea domain is the same as archaea kingdom. But you'll notice, like I said, that the eukaryotes are now split into multiple subgroups. So these kingdoms, the features of them, their defining characteristics, do not differ from what we talked about in the domain classification system already. Remember that the bacteria and the archaea are prokaryotes. Our first group of eukaryotes are animals. This is what humans fall into. We're usually multicellular, although there are some single-celled animals. We all have a nucleus in our cells. We don't have cell walls. We're all heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means that we have to eat food to get energy. Some animals are sessile, meaning they don't move. They're stuck in place like a sea sponge or an adult coral. Other animals are mobile, meaning we can move around. Some animals reproduce sexually and others reproduce asexually. The next eukaryotic kingdom are plantae, or plants. Plants are usually multicellular. They always have a nucleus. They always have cell walls around their cells, but these cell walls do not contain the polysaccharide called chitin. Chitin is something you will read about in the textbook, and pay attention to its significance in terms of understanding the evolutionary relationships between plants, fungus, and animals. Other distinguishing features of plants include their capacity to perform photosynthesis. So plants are called photosynthetic, meaning they get energy from sunlight. Plants tend to be sessile, meaning they are stuck in one place. But a notable exception is that some plant gametes can travel. Sometimes gametes can swim. Some plants reproduce sexually, or reproduce asexually. Additionally, some plants can reproduce in multiple different modes depending on the stage of the life cycle that the plant is in. It could reproduce sexually or asexually. And a benefit to sexual reproduction is that it produces more genetically diverse offspring, because you're mixing up your genes with the genes of the other parent to produce an offspring that is not identical to either one of the parents. Here in the image, I have included many beautiful and delicious plant species. These include anything that produces fruit, flowers, or cones. Plants also include more primitive things like mosses and ferns. The next eukaryotic kingdom are the funguses, called kingdom fungi. Funguses are usually multicellular. They always have a nucleus. They always have cell walls. But fungus cell walls do contain the polysaccharide called chitin. Fungus are heterotrophic, like animals, it means that they have to find food from their environment to harvest energy. Fungus tend to be sessile except for some of their gametes, and fungus, like plants, can reproduce either sexually or asexually. Sometimes one species of fungus could do either, depending on the stage of its life cycle. Some example fungi include molds like bread mold. Yeasts are sometimes grouped into this kingdom. Mushrooms, like you might eat on your pizza, are fungus. And lichens growing on tree bark are also example fungi. That leaves kingdom Protista, or protists. And protists can be split into two subgroups based on their characteristics. So there are animal-like protists that are heterotrophic, meaning they have to find food and harvest energy from their food. And that contrasts the other group of protists called plant-like protists, which are photosynthetic, meaning they can harvest energy from sunlight. All types of protists are usually single cellular. They all have a nucleus. They are usually mobile, meaning they can freely swim around. And some of them reproduce sexually and others reproduce asexually. One notable thing you will read about when studying protists is this is a lump-all kingdom. Unlike funguses or animals or plants, in which the kingdom, the individual species that exist within each kingdom are genetically related. They have an evolutionary relationship. Within the kingdom protist, there's more genetic diversity. This is a catch-all term for any single cellular creature that doesn't easily become classified as an animal, plant, or fungus. So it's not true that all protists share a recent evolutionary ancestor. Instead, there's a lot of genetic diversity within the kingdom protist. So now let's talk about these organelles, because I haven't yet given you a definition. Organelles are a smaller than cell structure, a subcellular structure, that performs a specific function. In this image of a eukaryotic cell, you can see that there's multiple different organelles. The cartoonist has drawn them in different colors. They do, in reality, take on different shapes depending on their function and how they're behaving in their life cycle. Organelles do not exist outside of cells. They are, in fact, produced by cells. They're built from instructions carried in the genetic code of the organism. And so each organism can produce its own organelles. Organelles come in two varieties. There are the membrane-bound organelles that are only found in eukaryotes. Some examples of these are the nucleus, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, lysosome, Golgi apparatus, vacuole. And other organelles are found in all life forms, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And these are not membrane-bound organelles. These are usually smaller structures or more evolutionarily ancient structures like ribosomes, which build proteins, DNA, also called chromatin, and a cell membrane, which is like the balloon of the water balloon if the cell is a water balloon. The cell membrane encloses the cell, separating the living cell and the environment inside the cell from the outside world. Membrane-bound organelles are interesting because evolutionarily they pop up later in the history of life, and they benefit the cell because they compartmentalize different environments within the cell, allowing different chemical processes to occur within the membrane-bound organelle without influencing the broader environment within the cell. This compartmentalization allows separate functions to be produced within separate organelles inside the same cell. This separation of labor allows different types of cell work to be performed, some of which might require a different pH, for example. That could limit, while a certain pH could be really good for a specific type of cell function, it may limit other types of required cell functions. And so limiting the space within which that function is performed inside this membrane of the particular organelle performing that function is beneficial to the cell. Having membrane-bound organelles also allows eukaryotic cells to grow larger because they are no longer bound to the pace of diffusion of, say, oxygen coming in from the outside environment or food diffusing across the cell. Organelles can travel within the cell and bring the products of their work along with them, delivering energy all throughout the cell at a pace faster than diffusion. So what you've learned in this lesson are two different classification systems, domains versus kingdoms, that biologists use simultaneously to classify different life forms into like groupings. You also learned distinguishing features of eukaryotes and prokaryotes. You know what kingdoms and domains belong to each of these groups. You know that eukaryotes are larger and have more DNA than prokaryotes. Also, eukaryotes contain membrane-bound organelles like the nucleus. And eukaryotes sometimes produce sexually, which is not something any prokaryotic cell is capable of. You also learned that the function of membrane-bound organelles is to compartmentalize cells into multiple environments, each environment supporting its own unique function.